Good afternoon, all of you. My name is Yashara with my classmates Shiven, Shivansh, and Ayush. We all are here to tell you about case study of WTO, World Trade Organization, a global trade regulator. Now I will start with a little introduction about the WTO, World Trade Organization. World Trade Organization was established in January 1st, 1995. It is the only global international organization dealing with the rules of trade between nations. The WTO, World Trade Organization, is an association of 146 member countries of 190 countries in the world today. So almost all the countries in the world are members. There are all types of countries in the WTO: capitalist, socialist, rich and poor countries, very industrialized, and also developing countries. Now I will start with question 1 given in the case study. Now I will explain this question with points. No trade wars for the past 20 years. I will explain this point in brief. No proponents of the World Trade Organization think it was successful in meeting its objective. Firstly, they point out the fact that there have been no trade wars for the past 20 years. Almost the average tariff was close to 35% when World Trade Organization came into existence. Now, second point is WTO has eradicated trade and non-trade barriers. The WTO has only enhanced the value and quantity of trade, has helped in eradicating trade and non-trade barriers. WTO has also broadened the trade governance scope to trade in investment, service, and intellectual property. Now my second point is WTO has emerged as a greater institute than GATT. It has emerged as a greater institute than GATT and including expanded the agenda by including the development policies, settlement of disputes, and improved monitoring by introducing the trade policies, reviewing the World Trade Report, as will increase transparency by removing green room negotiations.
WTO has reduced inequalities among countries. The fact that there is a single set of rules applying to all members greatly simplifies the entire trade regime. The WTO cannot claim to make all countries equal, but it does reduce some inequalities, giving smaller countries more voice, and at the same time freezing the more powers from the complexity of having to negotiate trade agreements with each of their numerous trading partners. The WTO is the single most effective international agency. The World Trade Organization is the single most effective international agency with the pending inclusion of China. Governments that represent 85% of the world's population and about 95% of the world trade have chosen to bind themselves to the WTO rules and dispute settlement procedures. The WTO is the world only international organization that supervises 95% of world's trade. The WTO is the world only international organization that supervises 95% of the world global trade. The WTO agreements include numerous provisions giving provisions giving developing and least developed countries special rights or extra leniency, special and differential treatment. Among these are provisions that allow developed countries to treat developed countries countries more favorably than other WTO members. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade GATT, which deals with trade in goods, had a special section on trade and development, which includes provision on the concept of non-reciprocity in trade negotiations between developed and developing countries. When developing countries grant trade concessions to developing countries, they should not accept the developing countries to make matching offers in return.
Hi,
My name is Shivansh, and I'm going to tell you about how the rules and regulation of international trade framed by WTO have been largely influenced by the developed nations such as called US. Now, basically, there are two aspects of looking at this. Firstly, understanding the relationship between US and WTO. Now, US is an original member of WTO and a steadfast supporter of the ruling-based multilateral trading system that it governs. Working through the WTO, the US is able to protect and advance the economic interests of American business and workers while opening the foreign market. Now, these action protects and create jobs and support the economic growth at US. The US is also the world leader in securing the reduction in trade barriers to expand global trade and global economy opportunity. Now, to raise standards of living and reduce poverty, US contributed a lot. Now, the WTO agreements also provide the foundation for US and a bilateral and regional agreements. Now, there was an article published in the Hindu Times which says that has US crippled the WTO as the trade war between China and United States shows no sign of ending. The Washington DC has paralyzed the WTO by paralyzing its appetite body, which acts as the Supreme Court for international trade. Now, the US chose to spike the appetite body by starving the funds of its functioning. It has also stalled the selection process of filling 6 vacancies at the appetite body. Consequently, the appetite body is left with only one members who will not be able to deliver any rulings on pending trade disputes, as a minimum of 3 members are required to adjust and adjudicate any dispute. Now, to understanding more about WTO, we need to understand what is appetite body. Now, WTO, the global trade disputes are complex and difficult to resolve. For proper enforcement of trade rules, a binding two-stages dispute settlement system was established at WTO in 1990s. Now, the appetite body is the scaffolding or the stages of dispute settlement with 7 standing members. A minimum of 7 standing members are required to provide any jurisdiction for the decision. Now, there must be a question in your mind how the US unilateral stand affect the developing countries. Undoubtedly, it is a tremendous loss for the majority of WTO members who are all developing and poor countries. Clearly, they lack the political and economical clout to enforce their right and protect their interests in a system governed by the power, not rules. Now, as for SOFAs, we have a video clip to show you to demonstrate are the developed nation being dominant on WTO and on developing nations. Thank you.
Donald Trump says he wants to overhaul the World Trade Organization, claiming the way it classifies countries is inaccurate.
The WTO is broken when the world's richest countries claim to be developing countries to avoid WTO rules and get special treatment. No more.
A White House report says that 7 out of 10 of the richest countries in the world are considered to be developing and get special treatment. Some other nations, including US ally South Korea, also claim the status of a developing economy. The biggest criticism is aimed at China, though, which, according to the memo, is exploiting its WTO status for its own benefit. US accusations against China are part of a long-standing rivalry, which also plays out in the WTO. During Donald Trump's presidency, as we've reported, additional tariffs were imposed and the Huawei tech company was sanctioned big time, all against the rules of the trade organization. Trump's predecessor, Barack Obama, also imposed tariffs on China. Economist Ike Hammer thinks this shows the hypocrisy, then, of the US towards the WTO.
It looks hypocritical now because now the US is in a different situation. Let's face it, the US is basically bankrupt since the world doesn't accept the US dollar in that amount anymore as it used to be. So the US sort of lost its basically free credit card. They had free lunch for all the years where the international, for the other countries, acquired dollars and gave them the goods and services. So this doesn't work anymore. You cannot only change rules in favor of yourself when as you need it. So in good times, you do the one side, and in bad times, you do the other side. That doesn't work. So you have to have reliable rules for all the times.
So I'm Shirin Yadav, and I'll tell you the failure of the WTO's ministerial meeting, which was held at Cancun. So on September 14, 2003, the meeting of WTO ministers in Cancun ended without reaching consensus. According to press reports and subsequent statements by those present at that meeting, the apparent and proximate cause of the ministerial's collapse was a failure to agree on the launching formal negotiation on the so-called Singapore issues. The developing countries has made it quite clear that they were opposed to negotiation on investment and competitions. the two most contentious Singapore issues. Commissioner Lemmy in particular showed a lack of negotiating acumen in not dropping these issues at the outset. He may have wanted to keep these as concession to be made during the negotiations, which is what he did, but would have strengthened the EU position had he dropped these before Cancun. As it was, the US must have been secretly pleased to see the EU attract all the flack for insisting on measures seen as promoting solely the interests of the multinational companies to the detriment of developing country governments. The fundamental role of the WTO is to facilitate trade negotiations. The various trade related issues, mostly introduced in the Urigori round at the behest of US corporations, have detracted attention from and ultimately undermined the core purpose of the WTO. Thank you.